floor in my yome, I'm choosing to keep it simple. I'm going to install those interlocking rubber mats, the kind you would see in a kid's playroom. They're cheap, they're easy to install, and it's easy to replace one if it gets damaged. Now I can't put the whole floor in at one time because there's certain sections where that rubber mat's not going to go. So I'm going to start by putting in just half of it now. I finally got my stove, and I'm looking forward to getting it put in, but first I have to have a hearth underneath it. So I could have bought a hearth, just a prefab one, and dropped it on the floor and put the stove on and have been done with it. But instead, I've decided to build my own brick hearth. That way, I can make exactly the size that I want, plus the bricks are heavy, which means they'll contain some of the heat from the fire, and if the fire goes out, it'll help keep the place warm a little longer.
You know, I always thought that I was pretty good at thinking outside of the box. But one of the lessons I've learned since moving out here is you can't think outside of the box when you don't even know that you're in one. And the way that went down was that when I first made my commitment to purchase this land, I went into this whole problem-solving space of how I was going to get my basic needs met. And all of my thinking was around things like, well, how am I going to get the electricity grid out here? How am I going to get running water piped out here? And it wasn't until I had my first real conversation with somebody who had seriously lived off grid that I realized that that was a completely silly way to think of it. He just laughed at me and said, why would you do that? You can use solar for electricity, and you can dig a well for water. And it was in that moment that I realized that the only experience I had thinking about solving that problem was the experience of living in a modern home. I just had no other way to even conceptualize it. So when I tried to solve the problem, that's exactly where my mind went, which is pretty hilarious. And also very humbling, and also has me wondering to myself, what other boxes am I living in that I have no idea about?
Winter's coming pretty fast here in Maine, so it's time for me to get some heat in my yome. To heat it, I've chosen a small Vermont casting stove. It should be plenty powerful enough to heat this space. A yome is basically an insulated tent, so it is kind of leaky, but this stove should have enough firepower to keep me warm even on a cold winter night. The stove setup is now complete, which means I've reached a real milestone out here. I've now got shelter and a heat source. That's of course as long as I can get this thing lit. Let's give it a shot. first attempt at getting a fire started was a failure. But as you can see behind me, my second attempt was a success. So I now have a heat source in my yome, which is excellent, as I could see my breath as I was outside working today. It's starting to get pretty cold here. I haven't built regular fires in a while, but I did in my late teenage years. There was a period of 3 or 4 years where the place I lived didn't have central heat. We only had a wood-burning stove, and so I had to build fires to keep myself warm during the winter. There was a few times, actually, where the stove went out in the middle of the night. I didn't properly kind of close it up for the night, and it went out. And I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, freezing, and could see my own breath, and realizing, like, oh God, I gotta get up and build a fire. So trudge out into the snow, get logs, barely awake. It was pretty miserable. I'm guessing I have a few of those days in store for me this winter too with this new stove until I get used to it. But it's going for now.